Estimados y estimadas, solamente para que se queden tranquilos de que ya estamos aquí todos conectados, ya está Johan Norberg también en el salón. En 2 o 3 minutos les damos arranque mientras esperamos que se siga sumando gente, que todavía se sigue conectando gente, pero para que se queden tranquilos que estamos aquí del otro lado desde Fundación Libertad como para arrancar, así que 2 or 3 minutes and we'll start. Well, I'll say that in English so Johan understands what I'm.
Thank you.
Hola Garrett,
¿Cómo
¿todo
estás?
bien?
Todo bien, ya está Johan conectado. Estábamos esperando que se siga sumando más gente porque todavía seguía entrando gente a la sala. Pero ya cuando a vos te parezca podemos darle arranque, ya son las 12 en punto.
¿Johan está conectado?
Sí, está conectado.
Johan está...
¿Qué tal, Gerardo? Buen día.
Hola, buen día. ¿Qué tal? Hola Claudio.
Si les parece, arrancamos. ¿Te parece, Gerardo?
Dale, dale.
Perfecto. Johan, we are about to start. If you want to open your channel again.
I'm back.
I'll do an introduction in Spanish and then we can continue in English. So, I'll be saying that so we understand what I'm saying in Spanish. ¿Qué tal? Un gusto tener a todos presentes en este evento de Fundación Libertad. Mi nombre es Garrett Edwards y vamos a estar con la posibilidad de charlar y de conversar por un rato con Johan Norberg. Johan Norberg es Senior Fellow en el Cato Institute, es historiador, es escritor, ha escrito sobre globalización, sobre emprendedorismo, sobre libertad individual, es autor de una multiplicidad de libros, quizá uno de los más recientes que ustedes pueden haber leído en español sea Progreso, 10 razones para mirar hacia el futuro. Uno de sus más clásicos lo tengo yo acá en la mano, En defensa del capitalismo global, In Defense of Global Capitalism. También es muy conocido por su cantidad de artículos en medios periodísticos y por sus videos en el Free to Choose Network, donde podríamos decir que es una suerte de Milton Friedman de la actualidad con sus apariciones. Johan, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today and to be able to chat with you a little bit. The idea is first to ask you some questions, and then if we have enough time left, to let the audience also ask you some questions so they can enjoy the chance of having you here with us. It's really, really a big pleasure. So I think that there's this maybe easy question to ask you first, and it's an easy question maybe to ask, but maybe not so easy to answer. One of your latest op-eds in the Wall Street Journal had a great title in 2019, which was "The 2010s have been amazing," right? Which, I mean, I guess that we can all agree, and you have all the data in your books, starting with this very book that we mentioned before. What can you tell us about the start of the 2020s, right? With COVID-19 and everything that's going on.
Yeah, that op-ed was quite controversial when I wrote it, to say that these were the best years for mankind ever, but I guess it would be even more controversial if I try to repeat the trick next year, because so far 2020 has not delivered. But first of all, I think it's important to just repeat what I said in that article, because we often take this development, this progress for granted. We've had the best 25 years of social, economic progress, health progress by almost any indicator during these last 25 years. We've reduced extreme poverty by 130,000 people every day during this era. We've increased life expectancy, reduced child mortality by around 50% during this time. It's quite astonishing, and we're almost making software to communicate work as well without getting noise in the background as well. There are so many things that have been accomplished. And that has also given us an opportunity to deal with the risks and the threats that we're facing.
I don't think that's perfect, Norbert. Now we're listening to you.
I'm back.
Just
yeah,
we're back. So you were telling us?
Despite the horrible pandemic that we're seeing right now and the response, which in some ways I fear might be even worse, we should remember that if we had to pick a year in humanity's history to face a pandemic, I would be hard pressed to find a better year than 2020 because of the level of scientific knowledge, the technological progress that has been made, the wealth that is at our disposal, which means that we've never responded to a disease as quickly as we have right now. Now every hospital is crying out for more ventilators, but in the year 1950, we only had a total number of 1 ventilator on planet Earth. That kind of medical technology is quite new. We are now reading the genome of the virus in a week, but that was a technology that didn't exist before 1995. And whatever happens next, whatever the toll that comes from the disease and from the lockdowns and so on, the kind of wealth, the kind of digital technology and ability to communicate and cooperate against the virus gives us something, a little bit of hope, I would say. It took us 3,000 years to develop a vaccine against smallpox and polio. Now it's been some 3-4 months since we learned about the new coronavirus, and we already have many promising drugs and vaccines that are under clinical trials. So, well, it might not be that 2020 is the best year ever. Perhaps 2019 is when it comes to these indicators, but I wouldn't want to face this kind of pandemic any other time in human history.
Johan, what you're saying is really interesting. I mean, I think that's a way of looking at this great thing that we are all going through in a different lens. And you've also been known to say another idea that I think it's quite important to take into account nowadays, that we're addicted to bad news, right? Would you agree that that statement remains even truer nowadays, that we are all worried about what's going on with this virus and with the United States and with troubles that may arise with nationalist extremist movements and all of that?
Yes, I think we're evolutionary hardwired to pay more attention to the drama and the horror than to long-term trends, for good reasons, because those of our ancestors who were worried, they survived and gave birth to us eventually. But this means that we only pay attention to the bad news. That's our default setting. It's very interesting when I compare this pandemic right now to how we reported in the 1950s and the 1960s, with the great flu pandemics, the Asian flu, the Hong Kong flu. And the Asian flu killed some 5 million people around the world. And that only got a small mention in at least the Swedish newspapers that I've looked at in that era. So there seems to be that, partly for good reasons, we have better information than ever. We know what's going wrong anywhere in the world right now. And there's always someone there with a cell phone camera, and they can broadcast it to us in real time. And that's a wonderful thing. It has democratized information, gives us access to more knowledge than ever before. But also it means that the worst thing that happens with pandemics, with riots, with extremist movements, that's the one thing that will top the news cycle in every country around the world. And I think that slightly distorts our perspective on things.
Yeah, I think one could agree that the market, meaning people that are watching news, they don't usually care about good news, right? It's like they don't want to see the firemen getting the cat from the tree. They want to see bad things happening, and especially if they happen far away and they don't have to worry about them happening near them, right?
Yeah. And you know, as it's been said that if newspapers were only published once every century, once every 100th year, the breaking news thing would be that, oh, we just increased life expectancy from 35 years to 72 years. The greatest thing that has ever happened to mankind. And we also reduced extreme poverty from some 70% to 8% today. Because that's the greatest thing that has happened to mankind. That's the long-term interesting indicator. But now newspapers aren't published every 100th year. So instead they're published every second. And we get this information all the time. And then the fact that we probably annually increase life expectancy by another month or so isn't that dramatic. It's not that shocking. It's not the big thing. So obviously it's the homicidal axe-wielding maniac, or it's the riot, or the pandemic. And it probably has to be that way. We're evolutionary hardwired to look for that kind of action, drama, intensity, because we feel that it's threatening us and that we need that information immediately. But we do need some context. We do need background. We need some history to interpret what is going on. And if the news doesn't do that for us, well, we're going to have to search for that ourselves and contribute to that ourselves.
Johan, for reasons that are obvious, you have written extensively about Sweden. You are Swedish, of course, so you know about your own country. And you have also written recently about the way that Sweden has been handling this pandemic, which is an issue that from Argentina, we have also tried to pay attention because, for example, I don't know if you've heard about it, our own president, Argentina's president, Alberto Fernandez, criticized the way that Sweden was actually handling the pandemic, and people from the Swedish government replied to Alberto, and they said, okay, we are always open to suggestions. We might not be handling the best way, but we are trying to do our best. And for example, today, Anders Tegnell, one of the state's epidemiologists, even said and went on record that there could have been better ways of handling. What can you tell us about the way that Sweden has been handling this issue?
Yeah, it seems like Sweden is suddenly a center of attention for lots of people, and for good and for ill. And often, like your president and President Trump in the US has warned people, let's not do the Swedish thing. They're hurting very, very badly. Well, first of all, what happened in Sweden? Why is Sweden an outlier when it comes to policy? That's because they wanted to implement Swedish public health authority, and the government wanted to implement social distancing and trying to flatten the curve of cases and deaths. And they thought that the best way to do that was to recommend it, to recommend social distancing and to make sure that people did this voluntary. It's not that Sweden hasn't done anything. This recommendation in itself is important, but also there have been some rules and regulations: no public events with more than 50 people, no visits to nursing homes for the elderly, things like that, but much, much less than in other countries. And the result of that, I think, is twofold. First of all, when we look at mobile data, cell phone data, it seems like we had a lot of social distancing in Sweden, and could be compared to it, not as much as other European countries, but not that different actually than in many other places. So it seems like people paid attention to the recommendations. They didn't want to hurt themselves and their loved ones and spread the disease. The difference with other countries is that it gave some room for local knowledge and individual needs. So if you really have to do something, if you really have to meet someone, if you have to go to work because you can't do it on a distance, you're allowed to do it because there's no policeman stopping you. And I think that on the whole, that seems like a way of paying attention to a rational interpretation of a precautionary principle, because we don't know which strategy will be most successful when it comes to public health. But we do know that clamping down on civil liberties and shutting down the economy takes a terrible toll on people and on public health in the long run. Great depressions aren't that healthy in themselves, and we know that it'll give us less resources to invest in new medical technology, in drugs, and for the public health system and hospitals in the future as well. So the question is then, how has it turned out? Do we deserve the criticism that we're getting? Well, Sweden is an outlier in policy, but not when it comes to outcomes. When you compare us to other European countries, Sweden is somewhere in the middle. We have done worse than our neighboring Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, and so on, but we have done better than most of continental Europe, Spain and Italy and Belgium and the Netherlands and Great Britain as well. So, and the key question is, how will this work out in the long run? Because the assumption from the Swedish Public Health Authority is that no country is going to remove this. They're not getting away from it in any way. No country can shut down its economy and its society until we have a vaccine, because that could be a year or several years away. And so the question is, how can we make sure that we flatten the curve to the extent that the healthcare system can deal with cases and give people intensive care, and at the same time try to keep society afloat? And other countries, that's the assumption, when they get out of their lockdowns, eventually it will seem like they only postponed cases and deaths. They didn't avoid them. And that seems to be what data says in Sweden right now. Sweden never surpassed the level of our healthcare. We always had around 20% excess capacity in intensive care units. We have a field hospital that has been built here in Stockholm with room for several hundred COVID-19 patients, and that has never been used. No patient had to be admitted there because there was always extra capacity in the normal hospitals. And now Stockholm politicians say it's time to dismantle that hospital before it has ever been used. So that seems to suggest that Sweden is past its peak, and we got out of it in a fairly good shape. Now, Anders Tegnell, our state epidemiologist, he points out that
even in Spanish. So
yeah, it's no one knows how to pronounce it. He says that, yeah, if we had known everything in advance, we would obviously have done things differently. And he said that all the time. This is trial and error, and we're constantly adapting our policies. For example, Sweden should probably have implemented a ban on visits to nursing homes at an earlier stage. But no one is suggesting that we should have had a total lockdown or closed down schools or anything like that in Sweden. And on the contrary, we've heard from Norwegian public health authorities that they regret that they shut down schools, for example, because that didn't help with the disease, but it hurt kids and it hurts parents who might have needed to go to important jobs, for example, in the healthcare sector.
Johan, there's always been, at least in Latin American countries, this comparison between a supposedly a present state and an absent state, right? There's this idea that, oh, you have a big state that's present and that's supposed to take care of you, which is what some people like and what some people vote. What's like having the experience of Sweden, which has, we could say, a present state, but one that actually respects civil liberties and civil freedoms, unlike many other present states that actually don't?
Yes, and I don't know really how this ties into that discussion, but I can tell you how the way it's worked. It's a state that has been quite closely trying to make sure that there's state capacity to deal with ongoing everyday situations and crisis situations, rapidly trying to scale up capacity in intensive care units, for example, and things like that. But at the same time, trying to make sure not to interfere too much with the lives of, with everyday life, because that goes on and it works. the market works. Companies are constantly switching resources into the areas where they can function, rejigging supply chains, making sure that we get the goods on the shelves and protective equipment for the healthcare system and things like that. People know more better than governments whether they need to have a particular pattern of mobility or something like that. And what the government then can do is to follow this closely, pay attention to changes, and then recommend changes, recommend according to the best data that they have. And this could be, at least some Swedes think it's a kind of a Swedish exception to the general rule, that we have a tradition of lots of trust, interpersonal trust in neighbors, in the stranger on the street, and even in authorities, and even in politicians. There could be a long historical pattern from the absence of feudalism in Sweden, and no recent wars or foreign invaders, occupations, or anything like that. Everybody has been small property owning farmers in Sweden, basically, and everybody knows everybody, and or at least they're related somehow. So the person in charge is probably your second cousin or something like that.
Yeah. So you know them. Johan,
so then this kind of recommendation, you pay attention to it and you trust them. Often that trust might be misplaced, but it also gives opportunities for more high degrees of freedom.
A few questions ago, you mentioned this example, this picture of the only once every 100 years newspaper where we would only get one big title, which would say, okay, so life expectancy is better, we have advanced and progressed this much. How do you think we might see the 2020 and 2021 in maybe 5 to 10 years? I'm not asking you in 100 years, but and I know it's hard because we don't have a crystal ball to actually know what will happen. But what do you think might happen in 5 to 10 years when we look back at these moments?
Well, I have to say that I'm a little bit worried about what the history books will say about this year. And it's not the pandemic in itself, because it is not as lethal and horrific as we thought it would be. We'll have other pandemics in the future that will be worse. I'm sure this is in a way a great test of our ability to deal with it and to relearn a couple of things. But I'm afraid of the lessons that we're learning and how it affects policies. And it could be in the longer run, if we end up in a worse place, if we are dismantling some of the supply chains, international trade, if some countries suffer from strongmen takeovers and the dismantling of civil liberties and the renationalization of parts of the economy, well, then history books will say that that started in 2020 with this pandemic. Because what I read from history, and I have a new book published it will be published in September, called Open, the Story of Human Progress. And that book, I'm trying to look at historical episodes of great human progress and how they end. And the sad thing is that the timing is perfect, because what I conclude is that openness in various ways, open markets, open societies, openness for exchange and mobility creates progress. But once we have large-scale crises, and could be great depressions, natural disasters, foreign invasions, and pandemics, people often react with a kind of societal fight or flight instinct. We want to hide from the world, hide within the tribe. We want a strong man to protect us. We want to build walls against the rest of the world. And that has often put an end to these great golden eras in history. in many great civilizations. And there is that risk nowadays, now as well. We already had a backlash against openness and open societies. There is the risk that that will be reinforced by this crisis. And in that case, I think history books will say that we should have counted to 10. We should have analyzed the situation better. We should have learned a little bit more from economics and history before we made these mistakes.
Oh, and now I'm worried, Johan. To tie in with what's going on in the States, which I think it's also an important thing to follow. You talk about social networks in a way before, about the democratization that the internet allows us, and we have this big fight between Trump and social networks, and now we have this George Floyd thing. How do you think what's going on in the States might affect the rest of the world this year?
Well, sorry.
Maybe it won't. If it will affect in any way, maybe it won't affect, I don't know.
Oh, it will have an effect, but we don't know what kind of an effect, and it depends on what happens next in the United States, I think, because that's also something that we're learning, I think, from past moments of crisis. Sometimes we panic, we search for the scapegoats, and we have this fight or flight tendency. But sometimes we realize what's at stake, and we cooperate better, and we find that we have more things in common than we thought that we had. And that's often the individual choice. That's often what happens. We have one great sociologist, Enrico Carantelli. He was a little bit frustrated because people only assume that every time you have a crisis and polarization and problems and riots, people panic and they become violent and so on. And his research led him to another conclusion. His research was based on going to those crisis areas and looking at what happened and talking to people. And he found out that on an individual basis, what individuals do is that they try to help others. Individuals, organizations, businesses, they put their neck out to protect the vulnerable, help those in need, and to get on with life. But that's not the collective response. There's always the risk that authoritative figures, could be historically church leaders during the Great Plague and Black Death, tried instead to redirect frustrations against the Jewish minority and to harass and kill them, or it could be political leaders trying to stoke division in order to get support and to dismantle civil liberties. If that happens, then you could get this more tribal instincts going as well. Both of those things can happen in the United States right now, and it's a shame that they have a president right now who is not known to kind of bridge divisions in society and to talk about the things that we have in common. So there is that risk, obviously. But I also see, when I move away from the breaking news cycle and some of the political voices, I do see a tremendous outpouring of societal cooperation and that could win out in the end as well, and that would have a nice effect on the world.
Johan, before we go ahead with questions from the audience, I think you left me this one like ready to kick it in and try to score the goal. So do you think right now the world is more ripe for conspiracy theories and all that things that usually happen when bad things come around?
Yeah, and that's another thing that we learn from history as well. We always have conspiracy theories, but specifically in times of crisis, when things are uncertain and we don't know what's going to happen next, we all clamor for certainty. We want to know, we want to understand what's going on. That's probably why we constantly update our flows of information, because we need a clue as to what's going to happen next. If we don't find that, it's very tempting to come up with a story or to accept the story that's out there somewhere, that someone bad did this to us because they have their own interests at heart. And it's very strange, but it sounds strange. Why would that give us certainty? But oftentimes it's better psychologically to have some sort of comfort to think that you cognitively understand what's going on. There's one influential person or group who's doing us because they want us harm. Because then at least you understand what's going on. Then the world is not as chaotic and complex as it seems. And perhaps you even have a chance to combat it if you have a powerful fighter on your own side. And that's why you can see this throughout history. In Great Depressions and pandemics, people, all those old stories about Freemasons and Jews and the rich elite and so on, they are suddenly popular. In times of harmony and rapid growth, they're not as popular anymore. And that's obviously something that people exploit for their own use and point out that, yeah, you know, I told them that these people are bad, and now people are dying in pandemics and there are riots and there's crazy things going on.
Johan, thank you very much. I'll say the next thing in Spanish so we can open for questions. Gente, ahora vamos a abrir el segmento del momento como para preguntas. Si quieren, o las pueden escribir en el chat. Algunos que ya fueron pidiendo la palabra les vamos a abrir el micrófono. Daniel, ¿le podemos abrir el micrófono, por favor, a Álvaro Vargallosa? So the first one to ask will be Álvaro Vargallosa, Johan. He is a member of Fundación Internacional para la Libertad. And I don't know if his mic is ready. Álvaro?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi Garrett, thank you. And hi, Johan, it's great to have you here and great to listen to you once again. So I have a couple of questions. One is about Sweden vis-a-vis the left and the right. And until recently, of course, Sweden was almost a paradigm for the left. The left throughout the world would showcase Sweden as the proof that the socialist model works. And of course, many of us who have looked at Sweden from outside, and even more so people like you who have looked at Sweden from inside, have pointed out that Sweden has been traditionally a liberal society, and that, you know, despite the fact that after the 1970s there was a significant growth in the power of the state and in terms of economic interventionism and particularly taxation, but by and large Sweden has a liberal tradition, and that made Sweden a prosperous country, and a country that could almost afford temporarily to spend a lot of money through government action. But in any case, it was a paradigm of the left. Now, suddenly, in this new context, in this new post-coronavirus context, things have kind of shifted. The left is criticizing Sweden throughout the world. Many on the right are sticking up for Sweden. I'm not talking about the populist right, you know, the Trump crowd, but I'm talking about kind of center-right free marketeers, if you will. They're looking at Sweden and saying, well, Sweden has respected certain liberties that many other countries in continental Europe have not. So I wanted to get your reaction to this, and how conscious are the Swedes themselves in Sweden that this kind of realignment is going on?
Yeah, hi Alvaro, nice to see you again. And those are very good questions. And you know, as a Swede, it's a small country of 10 million inhabitants. We love when the world pays attention to what's happening over here. And so yes, we're quite conscious about the fact that there is this discussion going on. And just to basically repeat what you were just saying, we've made a long journey to end up where we are right now in Sweden. We had this brief interlude of some 20-25 years when we experimented with socialism in Sweden, from say 1970 to 1990, something like that, the 70s and the 80s. But that was basically it. That's the moment when Sweden was really an outlier in a leftist way, when it comes to regulations and government intervention. And as you point out, we were already a rich country. We were already one of the richest countries on the planet when we started doing that. And that's why we could try to do that. And it's just like that old joke. How do you end up with a small fortune? Well, you start with a large fortune and then you waste lots of it. And that's what happened. And in the 1990s, we had this terrible financial crisis. And basically everyone said that we can't do this anymore. This won't work. We had it from one authority who said that the Swedish model of democratic socialism was unsustainable, perverse, and absurd. And that was the Social Democratic Minister of Finance. So quite consciously, both the left and the right agreed to reform the model and get back to the future in a way, the kind of the historical Swedish model of having very open markets based on private property, big multinational companies, and a more hospitable climate generally for free markets and free trade. And then again, after that horrific era, we have outgrown other neighboring countries. Now, it's difficult to put the pandemic into that kind of simple narrative, I think, in a way, because right now we have a social democratic government, and it's not the traditional socialist party anymore. It's very conscious about being internationally competitive, the Swedish model, making sure that the climate for businesses is always good, always fighting for freer trade. And it's interesting to see this is kind of a particular test, what happens in Brussels in the European Union. Even when the Social Democrats are in power, Swedish Social Democrats are on the side of more deregulation, more openness, more free trade agreements, and more of a frugal attitude, not waste taxpayers' money, and not giving subsidies to businesses or basically anything else. And that tells you something. But it's been Social Democrats in charge, and they've been mostly guiding this policy when it comes to the pandemic, keeping the society open, not implementing lockdowns or stay-at-home orders. It could be partly affected by the fact that they depend on being in power on two smaller free market liberal parties. So that could be part of it. But I also think it goes some way to probably, it's related to our longer term history, not the 70s and the 80s when the government told people what to do, because they've left it, and now it's more like they're more traditional Swedish. If you don't have to interfere with something, if it seems to work all by itself, don't fix what's not broken. Guess that's my 5 cents.
Alvaro, you had another question, or was it only that one? We can't listen to you. Okay, but I saw you moving your hands, so I understood. Johan, we have some questions from the audience as well, some more questions. Juan Andres Maciel asked, what can you tell us about the elites? What's their influence right now? And he mentions, for example, Jeff Bezos from Amazon.
Well, it depends on what we mean with elites and what we mean by influence. Is it an economic elite or a political one? If it's Jeff Bezos, it's probably an economic elite, which some people think are controlling the world and just sort of moving away from the rest of us, the 0.0001% basically, or moving away from us. I think elite is such a dangerous word because it could be an elite who's grabbing power by taking power from us, citizens and consumers, and having coercive power. But it could mean someone like Jeff Bezos, who got economic clout, I would say, rather than talking about power, by giving us goods and services that we all want and we all pay for. And then, is that a problem that he's becoming so super wealthy I have this thought experiment specifically with Jeff Bezos when I think about the fact that he's 10 million times better off than I am, probably, if it comes to total wealth. Some could be 20 million times better off, I don't know. Is that a problem? Does it even mean that he's 10 million times better off than I am? Actually, it doesn't. It only does if you measure it in dollars and cents. But if you measure it in any kind of access to technologies, to healthcare, to goods and services of the good life, then I would be hard pressed to find a single instance where he's really 10 million times better off than I am. Look at the kind of food that he's eating, the ability to get transportation. He can afford a private jet. Obviously, I can't.
Subjects that we all have that makes us like magicians for people from the 19th century and the 20th century.
Quite right. And that cell phone, Jeff Bezos probably uses a similar cell phone. And all those things, in all those instances, and it's even more important when we look at things like child mortality, the risk that his children would face an early death compared to mine, or his life expectancy compared to mine, and so on. The differences are in a way smaller than they have ever been before between the elite and the middle class, the global middle class. And why is that? Well, the interesting thing is that that has become the case only because people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Sam Walton and Steve Jobs, they were allowed to become super rich by reducing the price of all these technologies and goods and services to the extent that almost all of us can afford them suddenly. So I would say that the role of that kind of economic elite, as long as they're not sort of the kind of crony capitalists who depend on subsidies and bailouts and tariffs, but if they got rich on a free market, they got that power by giving us greater powers than we've ever had before. So good job.
Johan, we're getting a lot of questions. We're going to try to cover most of them in the time that we have left. Mariano Causino asked a question and mentions a country that we haven't mentioned before yet, but it's like in the middle of the focus. And he asked if you can compare Swedish public opinion regarding the US and China. And do you think has it changed a lot since COVID-19?
I would say that the view of both countries have deteriorated in Sweden recently. When it comes to China, because of the obvious fact that they hid the outbreak of the new coronavirus as long as they could, and the whistleblowers were detained by police, and that means that we've learned again that you can't trust a communist dictatorship to tell the truth, and probably they regret that now as well, but that's what you get when you build an authoritarian dictatorship. People are afraid of telling the truth, and the local police will always clamp down on whistleblowers. And that also means that we can't trust what the data that they're giving us now on COVID-19 cases in China, deaths and so on. And I think that public opinion of China has taken a turn for the worse because of this. When it comes to the United States, I think that it's a Donald Trump effect. The fact that he has tried to play the strong man on television, switching from denying that this is a problem at all and it will magically just go away, so I don't know, to rhetorically playing the authoritarian strongman who for some time talked about perhaps I should put the whole state of New York into quarantine, perhaps we should just sort of dominate and attack protesters and so on. He's not been the bridge builder that I think that a suffering country needs right now. So I think public opinion of both countries have deteriorated, but it's much easier for the United States to fix because the public opinion of the American society and the incredible ingenuity and power that's in American businesses that's very strong, and it's very hopeful what we're seeing there. And we're in a way all counting that American researchers and businesses are going to come up with the therapeutical treatments and the vaccines that we need in the long run. So that's more of a one-person issue, I think, than the Chinese one, which is about the whole political economic system.
Johan, we are getting some questions that can be tied together. For example, the ones that are posed by Pedro Chichimo, Leandro, and Fernando Alvarez. Some of them are worried about how these conspiracy theory groups and these extreme nationalists are growing. And do you think if this pandemic will be a gateway for them to get bigger and grow bigger and stronger? And on the other hand, which is tied to this one, what's your advice to freedom supporters around the world about how to face this pandemic issue and the fact that most people seem to tend to agree with big government policies in this context?
Yeah. Well, the first one is that yes, I'm worried about those kinds of conspiracy theories and how they open the way for some extremist groups, but in a big country like the United States, the groups might be small on a per capita basis, but that's lots of people with lots of armory and weapons as well. That is dangerous. Small groups can create lots of problems, and especially in the context that we're having right now with the riots and some cities on fire. It's not difficult, unfortunately, to see a scenario where extreme right-wing nationalists go out into the streets and not just stoke violence and sort of in different ways, but begin to attack people systematically, and it would create a very dangerous situation to that extent. As usual, the response, I think, to lies and deceit is openness. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. We have to look at what they're doing and constantly correct those dangers. But it is an explosive situation right now, and that's why it's so worrying when we have a political leadership in the United States that tries to stoke the flames rather than put them out. And on a broader scale then, the second question, yes, we always have this tendency to want some sort of big government and strong man to protect us, wartime socialism, making sure that the right things are produced and put in the right places and so on. And that's an incredibly dangerous tendency. And it's always a way of shooting yourself in the foot, because what if the strong man points in the wrong direction? The lesson from Europe is that the country that managed to come up and rapidly scale up tests was Germany, because of its decentralized healthcare system based on private hospitals and private laboratories. France has a very centralized healthcare system, and well, the strong man in Paris pointed in the wrong way, and they failed to do it. That's what we've got to learn, that information, knowledge is local, and we need to have as much openness to that local knowledge and that local ability to improvise as much as possible. It's not having one strong centralized solution, the kind of wartime socialism. It's just a way of losing information, losing knowledge, and replace millions of eyeballs looking at the problems, trying to solve them. Replace that with a tiny group at the top. I think that what we've seen recently is actually a great triumph of private entrepreneurship. Definitely in Europe, we've gone from having 12 companies at the beginning of this crisis producing protective equipment like face masks and so on, just 12 companies, to more than 500 in just 2 months. They rapidly rejigged all their production, all the supply chains to produce what was needed. That couldn't have done in a centralized way. It could only be done by local entrepreneurs and businesses understanding what they could do with the workforce that was at hand, and more importantly, knew what they could stop doing without creating damaging deficits and in other places of the economy. So I think what we should do right now is to look at what worked and what didn't work. Governments implemented export bans and border closures and tried to come up with centralized solutions to testing and so on. And most often they failed miserably because of that. Whereas what did individuals, organizations, and businesses do when they used their local knowledge? Well, they kept society afloat, and they made sure that there are still supplies on the shelves, despite the disaster that has appeared there. Point to those differences, and I think that will help us to get through this long term.
The last few questions before we finish, Johan, because we are almost to the 1 hour mark, so we'll let you continue your day and everybody else's day as well. Paulo Daniel Cisterna asked, do you think after the pandemic is over, jobless people without employment will get worse as a problem? Do you think that the leftish idea of a universal basic income might gain momentum in the developed world, since a lot of countries have been giving a lot of money for people that have lost their jobs in the last few months?
Yes, I think that this is the universal basic income moment. This debate is only going to get bigger afterwards. Because, I mean, some countries have tried to imitate it a little bit, because if people are actually banned from going to work, what are they gonna, where's the food gonna come from? Obviously, then you need to replace that with something. And it's been done in some ways in a reasonable way, some places in worse ways, I think. And for example, in the United States, and it's come in the with an over-generous unemployment insurance, which has actually given lots of people more pay than they did when they were employed, which will make it difficult for them to get back to a more normal situation. Is this the long-term situation? Well, I think that lots of people are going to say that this is the long-term solution to problems. I'm not sure that's really what we're learning. This is a pandemic. People have been forced to stay at home. That will not be the case soon in most places. So I don't think that this is a learning experience that we really helps us that much with this debate. On the other hand, there are some decent arguments for a basic income, specifically if it replaces other welfare systems that are based on the idea that you lose everything when you go to work. Well, perhaps we can get rid of those marginal effects with a basic income. On the other hand, it's incredibly costly, and do we really want government distribution to be paid to everybody like that? Those who don't want to work and those who don't need it. I'm not sure. I think it would be useful for us, people who believe in open markets and limited government, to try to talk about Milton Friedman's old idea of a negative income tax instead in this context, which is a way of supplementing income and reduce the marginal effects that discourage work that are built into many of the welfare systems. But at the same time, it's not a way to hand enormous resources to the middle class and the rich who don't need it. And it's not a way to give money to people who don't work at all. So that would hopefully, I think, inform the basic income debate in a better way.
Johan, we really want to thank you for all this time that you have taken with us. One last question. Is there something that you would have liked to have been asked, but we didn't ask you? Just that one question.
No, I think you came up with all the right questions. So I'm perfectly happy right now.
Okay, you didn't need to say that, Johan, but thank you. We would usually open all the mics for everybody to clap, but that always gets a little bit chaotic. So we imagine that people are clapping in their houses, in their home. We really want to thank you for coming out a libertad. Gerardo, no sé si quieres decir algo antes de que nos vayamos. So, thank you very much, Johan. We hope that you can join us again in the future. It has been a great, great pleasure.
That was
Muchas
my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a todos que se unieron a este evento de Fundación Libertad. Como ya saben, seguimos teniendo eventos esta semana que les vamos avisando siempre por nuestros lugares de contacto. Así que muy agradecido para todos. El evento de la jornada de hoy ha terminado.